Welcome back to Within Tolerance, a podcast for machinists by a machinist. I'm your host, Dylan Jackson from Proteum Machining, and this week I am joined by Devin Bodony of Lichen Precision. So, welcome, Devin.
Thanks.
So, let's get right into it. How did you get into manufacturing? How did you get to where you are now? And let's go all the way up to what you do now and what your company does.
Yeah. So do you want the long story or the longer story?
Hey, I got all the time in the world, so
Yeah.
whatever you want to share.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like a lot of the people that you've had on the show and I listened to. Um, it kind of goes back to when I was a little kid. I've always been super into machines and mechanics, and um, my my stepdad likes to like playfully tease me that like as a 4-year old I had a serious obsession with hydraulics specifically. Like lots of kids are into tractors, but I was like, hydraulics are my thing. Um, and would make my stepmom like pull the lawnmower out from underneath the house just so I could just like poke at it and look at it as a 4-year old. Um, so I've been super into all kinds of mechanical stuff since I was a little kid. Um, and then um, all of my parents split when I was like one, and both remarried pretty soon after. Um, and all four of my parents ran their own businesses and worked with their hands in one way or another. So my mom ran restaurants; she's a chef. My stepdad is a goldsmith. My birth dad is like a fine woodworker and instrument maker, um, and my stepmom is a uh, landscape architect, and my dad and stepmom did a ton of gardening, and they had all kinds of side hustles going as well. So I kind of grew up amidst people who worked with their hands and made stuff, and um, that was just a part of my life. Um, and then also when I was 4, I learned how to ride a bike, and that has been sort of my main interest and obsession since I was a little kid. Um, and bikes obviously are machines in a certain sense. They're covered with machined parts, they're welded together, all that kind of stuff. um, so the interest in mechanical things was there from a really young age. So scooting forward a little bit in uh, grade school, um, my dad moved to a place that had a place where he could put together kind of a proper wood shop. um, and I kind of had free reign in the wood shop. 9 to 12 years old is when I spent a lot of time in there. But I wasn't allowed to use the table saw or joiner, but bandsaw, drill press, sander, lathe, all that kind of stuff. I could kind of just go crazy in there, making model boats and swords and clubs and whatever. Um, and then also around that time, um, my stepdad had me start doing a quote unquote apprenticeship in the goldsmith shop, which basically meant like sweeping floors and cleaning glass. And then I would start to work on the skills. And usually it meant like making family presents for our extended family for birthdays and Christmas and stuff like that. Um, and really, what he would do is he'd lend me money to buy bike parts, and then I would have to show up every week to pay him back. So
Smart.
he kept me in there. Yeah, yeah, it was good. Like really instilled a strong work ethic, made me aware of what it means to borrow money. I was consequently very debt averse for a lot of my like early adulthood. Um, and yeah, so that was kind of early days, and then junior high. I kind of stopped making a lot of stuff when I discovered girls, of course, and started taking school a little more seriously. And into high school, and I just kind of like took it for granted that I was good at making stuff, but didn't really ever think of it as being a something I would do for work. I was still riding bikes. And then, let's see, jumping forward a little bit more, senior year of high school. So I'm kind of a dyed in the wool hippie, and I was like, took it very personally that global warming was a thing, and felt bad that I was driving to a school every day. I went to a private school. I didn't ride the bus. And so I decided I was going to ride my bike to school every day there and back. And it wasn't like around the block. It was 8 miles each way, which isn't crazy, but took a little bit. And I was doing it on for the bike dorks out there, I was on a Santa Cruz Bullet, which I don't know. Do you ever ride bikes at all? Bicycles? I know you're into motorcycles.
Yeah, I've had mountain bikes on and off for years. I'm in a current off situation, but
Yeah, so I was on this 6-inch travel mountain bike. It's effectively a downhill bike, and I was using it as a road bike. It was not very efficient.
yeah, that
Uh,
sounds rough.
yeah, but I was getting stronger. But pretty soon I was like, I need a road bike, and borrowed some money from my parents, which I would have to work back for, and bought a road bike, and fell super in love with road biking, um, and racing specifically, which is like renowned for taking over people's lives completely. Um, it's like you start doing it, and then pretty soon, like everything you eat is oriented towards riding, and like your sleep and your daily schedule, and pretty soon you have no friends, and all you do is train and go to races, and the only people you associate with are other bike racers. And um, so I graduated
Yeah,
high
one of
school.
my best friends right now, or not now, but he
Formerly.
raced in well, no, we're still best friends, but he formerly was uh, a road bike racer and now races downhill mountain bikes. But like he's always been like that is his thing, and it seems like once you get bit by it, you are hooked forever. So I
Yeah,
understand.
yeah, certainly. So coming out of high school, um, I was like, I'm not going to college. I'm going to become a professional road cyclist, um, which was probably not the smartest thing, but it was good in terms of that. Like again, like I learned how to work super hard, uh, and learned how to be very um, just dedicated and uh, I'm blanking on the word, but just like able to structure my life, stick to a plan, all that kind of stuff. And like about 4 years into that, I realized that I'm too big basically. Like cycling is all about power to weight ratio when it comes down to it. And I'm 6'3" and like around 200 pounds when I'm light. Um, so I'm not the ideal road racer build. And I went to a couple races with some pro talent there, and was like, oh, this is what this means. I'm just never going to be very good at it. Um, so I had a bit of a coming to terms with that. And um, so I forgot to mention, when I graduated high school, I was kind of trying to figure out what to do for work. And I ended up going to work full time for my dad, goldsmithing with my stepdad. Um, so throughout this whole thing, I'm doing goldsmithing. I am like developing that skill set of metalwork, which is very different from machining, but has some similarities. So I quit cycling, and I'd also been doing off and on carpentry work with my birth dad. Quit cycling, kind of like aimless, trying to figure out what to do. Making goldsmith, making jewelry, but not super excited about it. Um, and through my teens, I'd been going to these camps that were like wilderness skills camps, like primitive skills and wilderness awareness stuff. I'd go there in the summer for a week, um, and they kind of had a history of having people come back and help out when they got a little older. And I was like, I'm gonna go back to that, kind of get grounded, figure out what I want to do again, just take a break. And I bought a motorcycle and went on a big road trip. So I'm near Seattle, so went down the coast to California, visited some family, drove across California and Nevada into New Mexico where these camps were. Went to this camp for a week, kind of hung out in New Mexico for a while. It was like a month-long road trip on my motorcycle. And on the way home, and sorry, I know this is getting to be a long story.
No, please.
Yeah, on the way home, I was thinking, and my family had this little piece of property, or my mom and stepdad had a little piece of property kind of just around the corner from where they live. And I was like, you know what? I'd always talked about building a tree house or something crazy there. I was like, I'm going to build a cabin and start working with my hands again and build. I was with my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife. It's like, I'm going to build something, a place where we can live, stop renting. I didn't have any money really. So I got home, kind of started putting together some basic plans. Like I'd done a lot of woodwork, but I'd never like framed a house. And it pretty quickly became clear that like I didn't have enough money to pay for permits and a septic system and electrical hookup. And I was like, you know what? Screw it. I'm just going to go off the grid. Just being naive, basically. So when I ordered the lumber package, and I didn't have any power on the property because you have to have a permit to get, or even a temporary power set up. So I just started working with hand tools and built this little cabin over the next like kind of 3 or 4 months, basically. Just with basically a saw and a hammer and some basic stuff, more or less by myself. I'd get some friends to come over to help lift walls and whatnot. And that got me really into making things again. And I'd always been kind of interested in like off-grid, sustainable living, self-sufficiency kind of stuff. So that kind of like steered me back towards making stuff. And about a year, and I thought I was going to become like a timber framer or something. I was like messing around with woodworking, and about a year or two into that, so we're living in this cabin. My wife's finished college at that point. She's working at a farm, and we don't have any power. Our running water is like rain catchment, and we're basically living kind of a weird off-grid lifestyle. Like we both have normal jobs, but we live in this cabin without any running water or electricity. And we toured this farm that the guy was making his like super off-grid home, and he was building a wood stove from scratch that had like a hot water heater built it, like a hot water jacket built in to heat water, and it had this basically like he funneled all of the exhaust through this like manifold, and he had this row of solid state I forget what they're called exactly, but they're like a chip. Basically, you put a heat sink on one side and a heat source on the other, and the heat differential across them creates a current. And so he had this row of them on the back, and he was going to generate electricity from his wood stove, because in the winter here, solar power doesn't work. It's cloudy all the time, basically. I was like, that is genius. So I set out to do something similar, and I talked to him a few months later. I gave him a call, and he said, it doesn't really work very well because keeping the cold heat sink cold enough is challenging, and they have to be, I think there was some issue with like wiring in parallel versus series and differential heat across them. He's like, it's kind of doing the trick, but not so much. So I kind of
That
went
must
back
be
to the drawing
a
board.
Peltier device, right?
Yeah, that sounds right. There's like one company that has manufactured them. It's like a decade ago now, so I'm definitely blanking on who they are. But yeah,
I only know
that
of them
sounds right.
because they use them in PCs. They do the reverse
Oh,
where they supply a ton of power to them, and one side gets really hot and one side gets really cool, and they use them to like I think they use them in liquid cooled PCs a lot to actually cool
as
the
like
coolant.
as a heat pump kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah, that's the same thing. Um, so I went back to the drawing board, and I was like, maybe I'll mess around with steam engines or something. And this guy, a family friend, was was staying at our house, and I was on YouTube looking up steam engine stuff. And he was like, "Have you heard of a Stirling engine?" And I was like, "No, what is that?" And he's like, "Well, check it out." He had grown up in this commune in India, and there was a guy there who was super into these things and like generated power for the commune with the Stirling engines, these big ones. So I looked it up and instantly got super obsessed. Um, have you heard what? Are you familiar with what a Stirling engine is?
I think I've seen them because a few people on Instagram have made them.
Yeah, so they're kind of esoteric. They um, they were developed, I think, in the mid 1800s as an alternative to steam engines because like steel quality was really low and steam engines were exploding often and killing lots of people. Um, in the UK, I guess. And so this guy came up with this alternative, and it's a what they call an external combustion engine. Um, Basically, you have a hot side and a cold side. It's effectively a heat pump as well. So you just heat the outside with a flame, and in shuttling air back and forth inside of it, you get differential pressure basically as the air heats and cools. Um, So I looked at this thing and I was like, that would be perfect. You put the hot side in the stove, you put that cold side outside, off to the races in theory. um, and so I tried to make one in the goldsmith shop, and it's like interesting the difference between like intricate work and precise work. Because we did very intricate work, or accurate work. The difference between intricate and accurate. We did very intricate work and very precise work, but it was not accurate. Um, so I like went to the hardware store and got some brass tubing and brass rod and bar stock and like tried to cobble this thing together. And I'm like silver soldering all the pieces together. Um, and it did not work at all.
Oh, geez.
Uh, which is kind of to be expected. Um, and so I was like, okay, I need a lathe. Um, and was looking at like Chinese, crap benchtop lathes on the internet. And then I remember that a family friend had given my birth dad a little benchtop lathe like many, many years before. And he'd never got it set up. So I gave him a call because he had moved down to Southern Oregon at this point. And I was like, "Hey, are you using that? Could I use it?" Um, he was like, "Yeah, you're welcome to use it, but it's missing some parts, and I don't really know what they are." So a couple months later, I went down and got it and brought it back. And we had a kind of family acquaintance that is a machinist, who'd repaired a lot of my dad's woodworking tools over the years. He referred to him as the metal wizard. So he was, and I'd been to his shop a couple times as a kid. Um, Oh, so like one back up real quick. Like I'm getting into mountain biking really heavy in my teens. This is like the mid to late 1990s. Full suspension, disc brakes, all the stuff that's ubiquitous now was like just starting to become a thing. Um, and I really wanted disc brakes on my bike and could not afford them. And they were especially expensive back then. And my dad was a major proponent of the like build everything yourself idea, which is a hard lesson to learn to grow out of. But he was like, just make them yourself. I was like, cool. I don't have the tools. He's like, you need a lathe. And even as like a 12 or 15-year-old, I was like, I don't think that's right. Like looking at the lathe, I was like, I know how a lathe works, like in theory. Like I'd done a lot of wood turning at this point. I was like, I don't think you need a lathe. But anyway, we'd been to this guy's shop, and my dad had been like, "See, there's a metal lathe." And looking at the thing, I'm like, "Well, I get how that works, but I don't see how you make disc brakes with that. I think you need some other thing." Uh, so I'd met the guy when I was a kid, so I just stopped by his house and had this. So the lathe that I got from my dad was a Atlas Craftsman 6-inch benchtop, like classic little lathe. I got it in the back of this little funky Subaru, and stop by his house. And he comes out and he's like, "Oh yeah, it's missing the compound rest and the tool post." He's like, "I think if you buy a compound rest, I'll help you figure out the tool post part." And I think he kind of expected that I'd never come back. But I found one on, I think it was on eBay, ordered it. It showed up like a week later, and I came back to his house. I was like, "Here, how do I put this on?" um, and I think he was kind of excited that I had actual interest. And so I don't think it was that day. Like he had me come back and we made a little lantern style tool post. Are you familiar with like old school lathe tool holding?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So we made one from scratch, and he had like a fleet of lathes, um, but his kind of workhorse was an old South Bend 13. Um, and I think he wasn't. It was belt drive. He wasn't worried about me destroying it. So we made it on that, and as soon as we started working, I was like, "Oh, this is what I've been wanting to do since I was like 4 years old." I just didn't quite know it. Um, and I think even like I went home that day and talked to my girlfriend, now my wife, and I was like, "I think I've figured out what I want to do with my life." Um, it was just an aha moment. Um, And so pretty instantly, I was like, I think like a day or two later, I called him and I was like, "Can I come work for you?" Or just apprentice? Like, you don't have to pay me. Like, I'll just come and do stuff. And he was like, "Whoa, pump the brakes." Um, he was kind of in the midst of retiring, didn't um, didn't really need the labor, and his shop was really small. Um, and so he was like, "I don't think so. I kind of want my space." And I was like, "Crap. I guess I got to figure something else out here." So I had a woodworker friend, older guy, like probably 20 years older than me. And he had like a Bridgeport style knee mill that he bought new to make fixtures for woodworking, but he wasn't really using it. So I took my little South Bend, or not my South Bend, my little Craftsman 6-inch over there to his shop and set it up. Uh, and he said I could use his mill. Um, And so I built a Stirling engine. It was like basically, besides that little lantern tool post, it was my first real project. Uh, and it worked. It was pretty crude, but it worked. Um, and I brought it back to Dave, the guy who had the shop and helped show me how to make the tool post. And he got super excited. And like a couple days later, he calls me and he's like, "You should come check this out." And he built one that was, of course, super nice. Um, and I
That's
was a
messed
little,
up.
yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, he was like probably 60 at this point. He had like, a massive inventory of materials and fasteners and O-rings and everything you could possibly want, uh, and skills, obviously, which I did not have at that time. So we became friends through making Stirling engines, and we were kind of iterating, um, and I had this idea, which was, I think, ill-formed at this point looking back, but I was like, I am going to, you always approach things. You're like, I need this thing. Maybe lots of other people need this thing, which sometimes is the case and sometimes really is not. So I was like, I'm going to make Stirling engines, my own wood stoves for people who live off grid in the Northern Hemisphere. So like already knowing that's a pretty long description, like probably you're not on the right track. But anyway, I was fully convinced this is what I was going to do for work. Uh, and I convinced my grandpa to give me a loan to buy a couple basic tools. Um, and so I started searching Craigslist. I convinced that woodworker friend to sell me his Bridgeport knee mill. I found a South Bend 13-inch, like if you ever see pictures of like um, shop classes in the 50s, like there's just rows and rows of like that lathe. Got one of those and a TIG welder, like an old TIG welder, and found a little spot I could rent from a friend down the road. And basically just started learning how to machine and build Stirling engines. And they're pretty good at like teaching you how to be a decent machinist fast because they're really finicky. They don't like tolerate any friction in the system, or they just don't work. Um, and so that was kind of the next couple of years. Um, and was taking little side jobs here and there, but I'm still making jewelry, still doing other work. Um, and so, yeah, I think that's kind of the beginning. And it's from there, there's a lot in between. That was 2009, I guess, that I was doing that. And there's been a lot of circuitous here's and there's between now and then, but that's when I like properly put my foot in the door with machine tools and started learning about this stuff.
Okay, so how did you get from Stirling engines to where you are now, bike parts? And I mean, it seems like, well, I guess before we go down that route,
Yeah.
what do you do now? What is your company's name? What do
Yeah.
you guys specialize in? Machinery, all that stuff, and then we can fill in the blank between there and here.
Yeah. Companies Lichen Precision. Um, it actually used to be called Stirling Machine Works, but I changed the name about, I think, 2 years ago. Um, Long story there, but to tie in with the bicycle frame building that I was doing, which was Lichen Bikes, trying to kind of bring it all under one brand. Um, at the moment, doing primarily CNC milling, some CNC turning, um, sort of whatever comes through the door, and then with a focus on cycling related stuff. So servicing the custom frame builder community with frame parts, and right now a couple frame tools, but wanting to expand into producing more frame tools as well.
Cool. And then what kind of machinery do you have?
So we've got a Speedio S700 with the 16K spindle and a rotary fourth axis trunnion on it. And then just recently added the S700 high torque. That's just a 3-axis model. Um, got a 1988 Hitachi Seiki high tech 20S2 big bore version. Um, and then got an old like Victor, I think it's a 16-inch manual lathe, 16-inch swing manual lathe. I still have the Supermax knee mill here. Um, and then I have got, some random little support equipment, welder, saw, belt sander, stuff like that. Uh, but most of the work is going across those Speedios and the Hitachi.
Nice. And you had a Herco and got rid of that, right?
Yeah, there's been a whole line of things. So I guess maybe going back into how I got from 2009 and a couple manual machines building Stirling engines to now. Um, I was so this friend Dave, the guy who helped me with get off the ground. He was very much of the old school. He's the type of guy who could machine and fix tractor parts, in the field, and also could build you a radio from scratch. He's kind of that era where like you just knew how to do everything. Um, and he had sort of made his living as kind of as that type of person, right? Where like someone has a problem, they come to you and they're like, help me figure out a solution to this problem. Sometimes that's like, can you fix my roller skates? Is a famous example he was always telling me about. Like someone came and was like, can you fix my roller skates? He's like, well, sure, can. To his later career, where I think he spent the last couple, maybe 4 or 5 years of his career working with a company that built these automatic fish tagging machines. So I'm not sure if you're aware of it where you are, but here in the Northwest and in Alaska, salmon that come out of hatcheries have um, one of their fins is clipped, and I think they have a little like RFID tag or something in their nose, um, so that they can track what's wild salmon and what's hatchery salmon. Uh, and it used to be all done by hand. So they'd literally have people like with the little smelt that are, an inch to 3 inches long or something, like clipping these fins. manually, and it was a whole industry. And this company designed these machines where they would feed these smelt in one end, and it would run the fish through and clip their fins and do the little tag in their nose at some insane rate, like 60 plus, like basically like one a second or more, maybe. Um,
Jeez.
yeah, pretty nuts. And they're having to like sort them by size so that they're like, they're dealing with live fish at this pace. So it was a massive undertaking. And he was working, I think, basically with a couple of engineers and some biologists. And, he had his hands in the thick of it, designing and producing all the prototype stuff. Um, and so I kind of like came into this work like, that's what I want to do, is that kind of thing where someone brings you a complex problem and you have to like kind of bring all your skills to bear, machining just being one of those things. But it turns out that like as a I guess I'm like a 24-year-old or something, like there's not that many people who are going to trust you with those kinds of skills like projects. Like
Ain't that the
um
truth?
yeah, understandably, like looking back on it now, I'm like, well, that kind of makes sense. um I got to do some pretty cool things, honestly, given that. Um, but I sort of like started down the road of like, I don't want to be a production machine shop. I don't want to be like a specialty machinist. I want to make machines and tools and fix things and do all this stuff, and machining being one part of that. And that's kind of what I did for a while, but it's sort of, I think the way our economy is changing and the way the world's sort of shaped right now, that it's a really hard way to make a living because um, unless there's like specialty industries need things repaired, but like Joe down the street doesn't really get things repaired anymore. He just buys a new one. Um, and so you don't really, it's hard to develop a customer base of people who need repairs done, who want like little custom deals made for things they're working on. Um, and so it was really challenging. Um, but I was kind of like making it work. And then, so in high school, when I started road biking, I sold my mountain bike. And this is a mild tangent, but it'll come back. Um, and I didn't have one when I quit road biking. I kind of just stopped riding for several years. I got super into machining. I did some other athletic stuff, but I wasn't riding a bike. And I, I guess it would have been maybe like 2013 or something. I finally bought another mountain bike, and mountain bikes had changed a lot in the interim for the better. And I got really into riding again. Um, and I went on this road trip with my buddy who I rode with and who was a friend all through elementary school and high school, and we'd ridden together for years and years. And he's also a fabricator. Went on this road trip, did a bunch of riding, and on the way home, all of a sudden we were like, "Hey, we have the skills to build bikes now. We've been talking about this since we were like 10. Like, let's build some bikes." Um, and I crashed my bike the next day and separated my shoulder. And so I was
Oh,
like,
jeez.
yeah, but it was kind of a blessing in disguise because I was stuck on the couch for at least a few weeks. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to design a bike. Um, there's never going to be a better time. So I sat on the couch and designed a bike. And because I always seem to tackle things the difficult way, instead of doing what basically every other person who's interested in building a bike does and build a hardtail, I was like, I ride full suspension mountain bikes. I don't want to build a hardtail. I'm going to start with building a full suspension mountain bike, which is not the way to go about it if the goal is to successfully have a bike in a short amount of time.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
diving straight into the deep end.
yeah, straight into the deep end, which is kind of my MO. Uh, and so in classic, like just the way it is with many things, first we had to build all the tools, and that took a long time. Uh, but so I started to build this frame, design this frame, and when I had started the machining thing, like the idea, like first of all, I've never made that much money. We lived in this off-grid cabin. I don't know what I was making a month, like probably $700 or something, maybe a couple $1,000 at the most, like living off of basically no cash. The idea that I would ever have like a CNC machine was absolutely inconceivable. Um, my mentor friend Dave had a old Prototrack, and I was like, wow, that is the most incredible thing in the whole world. Like it moves on its own. Like I'd gone over to do a thing at his place one time, and we'd like thread milled these holes for the Stirling engine I was working on, where the cylinders threaded into this. I mean, it's not a block, but effectively like the base plate of the engine. Um, and I was like, that is amazing. Maybe someday, but I can't really comprehend it. So fast forward a couple of years to when I'm starting to build bikes, and it's clear that like CNC work is going to be necessary to make the linkage and the bracketry and all that kind of stuff. So I started searching around and found it was a Bridgeport knee mill, like a series one with a centroid conversion on it that was like a homebrew done version or setup. And it turned out that the guy who built it had died, and his brother was basically cleaning out his house and selling off his estate and basically just dealing with it. So I kind of got this like project machine that I could not talk to the person who'd put it together with because he was actually gone.
Oh my goodness.
And it ended up being like the machine was okay, but even just like wiring it, like I called up my good friend who's an electrician. I was like, hey, what does this look like to you? And he was like, oh God, no, electrical engineers, they just use any color for anything. Yeah, that's what it looks like. But we got it running. I didn't know anything about G code, CNC, like CAM at that point. Uh, but just kind of dove in, pulled my hair out a lot. It came with a computer that had an old version of Mastercam on it. And I think I spent like an entire day trying to figure out just how to set up the WCS. I was like, why won't this work? Like I'm clicking on the stuff, I'm making a toolpath. Why won't it generate a toolpath? Silly stuff like that. So the bike building kind of got me into the CNC work with that machine. Um, and I kind of went headlong into building bikes at that point and set this whole Stirling engine thing aside. I was also through this whole period kind of like easing off jewelry, working. So I think I was down to like 3 days a week doing that. I was toying with the idea of going back to school for engineering. But a repeating theme has been whenever I think about going to college, some opportunity comes along where I get paid to learn what I'm interested in. So right about like I'm in the process of like applying for college loans and stuff. Two people approached me, one to do CAD design work, and another to do like assembly and some machining for they were a chemical engineering startup that were working on like purification of silicon for solar panel wafers. Like I don't know how familiar, I was not familiar with the process until I got into this, but like the more pure the silicon is in a silicon wafer, the higher efficiency of electrical conversion you get out of it. And the way they do that is they actually, like, instead of it being like some physical process as we would imagine like smelting to be, they actually like convert it to a gas and then like react it with stuff and then like return it into a solid from that gas in an inert environment to generate this like super super pure, I don't remember, it was like whatever, 10 to the negative 20 or something purity of silicone.
Wow,
They were trying to,
that's insane.
yeah, I don't know if that's the actual number. Again, it's been a while, but it was one of those numbers that makes your head hurt a little bit.
Yeah, well,
Um,
just that whole process, like I mean, it sounds almost like PVD coding or something, where you're, taking a
yeah,
solid and turning it to gas and then returning it back to solid, and yeah,
yeah,
that's
it's a lot
really
like
interesting.
that. Yeah. Um, so they were setting up basically like a test like prototype reactor to do all this stuff, and where they could like manage the process dial it in before they would do a big installation somewhere. Um, but it was kind of a weird company. The guys were like real old school that ran it. Um, I could not just quite wrap my head around the fact that they were like, we were at a company working on solar panel technology, and the lead engineer was like a climate change denier. And
What?
yeah, and I was like, well, I mean, I guess you're in it because you like chemistry and the money or something, but I don't know. It was just kind of an odd situation. So I wasn't there for super long, but it was a cool experience, and I've actually done more work for them off and on over the years. Um, and yeah, it just wasn't quite my scene. There was no windows in the building. But then this other company that designed commercial composting systems approached me about CAD design, and for my own work, I had bought a copy of a Libre. I don't know if you ever come across that. It was like a SolidWorks knockoff.
Yeah,
They,
I've seen it a
yeah,
few times.
yeah. So they became like 3D systems, I think, and then came back to Libre. So I had like messed around with that quite a bit and kind of bullshitted my way into being like, yeah, I can work in SolidWorks, no problem. Like they're all the same. Um, and again, kind of just jumped into the deep end with that. So this is all simultaneous to me starting to build bikes kind of on the side as a hobby. Um, and did that for about 8 months. Uh, Desk job drove me crazy. I just couldn't handle it anymore. It physically hurt. Just sitting at a desk. I don't know. You probably work at a desk these days, yeah?
I'm like 50-50 or 60-40 out on the floor and
Yeah.
at a desk.
Gotcha. Well, I have compassion for anybody who has to actually sit at a desk every day because I found it extremely painful. um, but it was a good experience. I got like my SolidWorks chops down pretty solid. And then this guy that I actually met at a yoga class, he approached me about working for him, and he did FEA in the medical device industry, and also like characterization. So people would send him designs for medical devices that would go on a body. He'd do FEA analysis on the design, but then we would also like characterize the material in a lab. Um, and this other crazy world, the specific thing he hired me for is there's all these companies that basically just like buy up whole lots of patents and then sift through them and be like, maybe this one will fly, maybe this one will fly, and then they hire people to proof of concept them. And so he brought me on to work on this proof of concept for a thing that would go inside people's eyes to hold their retina in place while they reattach. Basically, I forget the name of uh, the disorder when your retina starts to detach from your eye, but like at the time, the way that you would deal with it is they would like inject your eye full of some oil, and there would be like this oil bubble that would essentially float. You had to like keep your head down for like weeks, and this oil bubble would like float against your retina and push it back into place. And it was like this is a very challenging procedure, or what's the term? Like anyway, it's a treatment for this. They were like, if we come up with this weird little spring thing that we can inject with basically a syringe and it'll hold it in place, then the person can go about their normal life while it reattaches. Then we pull it out at some point. Um, and he specialized in nitinol. Are you familiar with that material?
Yeah, the heat uh, memory material.
Shape memory, yeah, and it's affected by heat. It's a super elastic alloy. Um, it's like if you've seen those glasses that people wear, like just eyeglasses, then you're like, yeah, they bend the hell out of it and it goes right back to where it was. That's nitinol. Um, I think it's like exactly 50% titanium, 50% nickel. It is like probably the worst material known to man to machine. Like you basically can't machine it. Like actually you literally can't. You have to like EDM it, or laser cut it or abrasive cut it. Uh, so we're designing this eyeball thing out of nitinol wire, and basically he just like let me loose with the CAD program in his lab, and the way you like set it to a shape is you attach it to a fixture of some kind, and then you dip it into a salt pot that's at like 1100 degrees for, I think it was probably like 20-30 seconds or something. And basically it kind of takes the shape that it was set in. If you were to then heat it up again, it would go back to its original shape, which is the trippy stuff about the material. So I'm basically just like kind of tinkering. Like I've got all this stainless steel tube that I'm using, sawing with a handsaw and bending and making these weird little fixtures to wrap this wire around, and making these little like pretend injection tools for like putting it into place. And like I made a little mock-up eyeball out of a ping pong ball with the hole cut so I could see where, like, through what the dilated pupil would be, and practicing this little
Jeez.
procedure and stuff. It was pretty trippy. And at the time, like, I'd never made money that well there. I'd never made that good of pay. So it was pretty fun. And then we started running as soon as we got that to like a point, and I was like, I can do this pretty well in this ping pong ball. We sent all the stuff that I'd made back to a doctor, an eye doctor on the East Coast that was part of the project, and they like attempted the procedure in like a pig eye, basically, that had been taken out of a dead pig. And they couldn't really do it. They were like, yeah, we kind of need something that's just plug and play. And I was like, wow, I guess that's how that stuff works. Like, you kind of imagine that like doctors have like intimate experience with all the tools they use in your body, and sometimes it's not. Like, they just buy this kit and they're like, yeah, this is how you use it. Make an incision here and then plug this thing in.
Oh
Uh,
my goodness.
yeah, it was a pretty interesting window into the whole world of medical. I'm sure there's lots of people in the machining industry, probably people listening to this, that have much more exposure and understanding. But I was like, wow, that's pretty crazy that's how that works. So that project got shut down, but he kept me on, and we did this long process where we were doing basically like stress strain analysis and crack propagation characterization in Nitinol. And it was like a research paper that he was doing to present at a conference. Um, but it was pretty cool. I built a laser interferometer body for him. So he had the lasers and the lenses, but we built this whole kind of stand that held all the lenses in place. And it got mounted to this optical table. And then I was prepping all these samples, these little like dog bone samples, essentially, that we would put into a pure bending fixture in what's it called? A voice coil load frame. So it's basically like a speaker that you could use to stress materials at super high frequencies or low frequencies, depending. Um, and then we were actually like prepping the face of the sample to have and applying an interference grid onto it, and then
Jeez.
have we had a little like notch, basically, EDM'd into it, so that would be a stress riser. So we'd start the crack there, and then he had this like high school kid who was a total whiz with programming, um, develop this program that would take, so basically like we put the thing in this fixture, we're stressing it at like say 60 hertz or whatever. So it's bending back and forth at 60 hertz. We're shooting these lasers at it and pulling an interference pattern off of it. And then this computer program was set up to take that data. It would strobe in time with uh, the load frame, so we could like look at it like at its deepest part of its bend or the flattest part of the bend, and then it would actually analyze the visual data coming off there, and we could like see cracks propagate before they were actually propagating. So you could see the material moving before there was ever an actual crack. And it was really cool. It was quite a interesting project to be a part of. And he basically had me prepping all the samples, setting the whole thing up. I was kind of programming the load frame. It had like a I wouldn't call it CAM, but it was basically like you'd set up all these different routines with what the frequencies were, how the feedback was put back into the machine, whether it was like on displacement or load or all that kind of stuff. And you set up these routines to run it through basically a life cycle of the material. The idea being that like a medical device that goes in your body that's made out of this stuff, like say a heart stent, um, gets like put into one of your arteries, and that artery is like contracting and expanding with every heartbeat, and so it's actually stressing the device that's in there. It's like not static. um, so they have to characterize the specific device and also the material to see what kind of stress and strain and where cracks are going to propagate and if they're going to propagate, like if you're going to put it over the fatigue limit of the material, basically just from being in the body, because you can't have something like that break. Um, so it was pretty cool. How did I get down that road? Oh, that was just what I was doing in between. So I quit that. Um, there's a pattern developing here. It was kind of high stress, and we were renting. We'd moved out of our cabin that we'd built because we got tired of trying to live like a normal workaday lifestyle without power and running water. So we were renting a place, but we were sick of renting. So we decided we were going to build ourselves a tiny house. Um, so we found a place that we could rent uh, that had room for us to build in the driveway. It was a friend's place that was on some property, and I quit that and just went full bore into basically building the tiny house on a classic tiny house on a trailer kind of mobile situation. Um, did
That's
that.
crazy that that's what you did, because like one of my fiance and my favorite things to do before bed is like watching a bunch of tiny home
Yeah.
YouTube videos recently, like over the last, I don't know, 8 months or so. So that's
it
crazy.
it is a solution. It's not necessarily the best solution, but it serves a purpose. And this at this point, it was like we weren't ready to buy property. We didn't want to pay rent. This was like the interim option, basically. Like my grandfather had just passed away and left me some money, and it wasn't like enough to like just go buy a house, but it was enough to build a tiny house. And we're like, well, we can invest in this, save ourselves rent over the next few years, have a place that we can park on property when we finally find a place that we want to be. My wife's a farmer, and has been doing that since 2008, I think. Um, but she'd been working with other farms in other places, and we hadn't found a place for her to start her own farm yet. Um, so when I quit that eyeball thing, the Nitinol job, that was the last time I've like properly had a job with someone else. So I stopped to build the tiny house and basically just never went back to work and went to work in my shop. Um, and that's when I went headlong into the bikes and was like, I'm going to be a frame builder. I'm going to specialize in making full suspension custom mountain bikes. This is going to be my thing. Um, and I built a prototype that I rode myself. I built one for a friend. It was like a kind of a pro-am female enduro racer at the time, um, and then started working on a Kickstarter campaign to develop this model that I was going to put out. I built the first one on that design and took it to NABS, which is the North American Handmade Bicycle Show in California in 2016. Um, and in that interim year is when I built the shop that I'm in now, which is on my in-laws' property. They were just moving here, and my father-in-law was going to build a shop, and I was like, "Hey, can I help you pay for it, and we'll make it twice as big?" Um, and they were super gracious and said yes. Um, and in that process is also when I kind of graduated from the Bridgeport Centroid conversion to buying that Fadal. Um, which was my first VMC. And my thinking at the time was like, if I'm going to actually build bikes, I need to have a machine that can kind of run and make the machine parts while I weld on the frames and do all the handwork and prep, which was a nice idea, but I wasn't really like comfortable enough as a machinist at that point to just kind of let it do its thing. And I was doing such low volumes of parts anyway that kind of wasn't really the case. But it got me in the door with a VMC, and making those frame parts was effectively my CNC education, because I always say that like bicycle frame parts, bicycle parts in general have like all of the requirements of like aerospace parts in terms of lightness and complexity, but no one wants to pay aerospace prices for them, and no one gives you proper prints. Um, but so it was a good learning experience for CNC work. Um, I was working primarily with 4130 and aluminum and some relatively tight tolerance stuff. Um, and yeah, so that was the Fadal. What else happened in there? Um, oh, that's also when I got this kind of crazy job that was a distraction from bike building, but also a really good learning experience, and kind of more in line with the fish tagging kind of thing, where some local friends were starting a kombucha brewing company, and they were scaling up and they needed a bottling solution because they were doing like a hand fill. It's like you can get these kind of like semi-automated hand fill solutions,
Hmm.
but they don't really work for carbonated beverages. You have to have a counter pressure, they call it. Basically, like you pressurize the bottle so that when you fill it, the the carbonation doesn't come out of solution while it's filling and just turn to foam in the bottle. Um, and in classic style, they were like, "Hey, we're looking at these used machines, but we kind of don't like them. We want to have something that will use different bottles and we can adjust and does all this stuff. Do you think you could match the price of a used machine?" And I was like, "Yeah, no problem. That'll be fine."
Yeah, of
Uh,
course.
yeah. It's like learning the lesson of the difference between understanding how something works and understanding how to make something work. And one is an order of magnitude more difficult. Um, so I said yes to this, and they kept kind of adding on features that they wanted, and I kept saying yes, and it turned into like a year long almost process of building this bottling machine. Uh, and I was doing the whole thing from scratch. So like all the machining, all the design, all the automation of it, and what it kind of ended up being is they wanted a machine that could fill uh, several different size bottles, could with counter pressure, carbonated beverages, several different size bottles, and they wanted to be able to cap it as well with two different styles of caps. Um,
Oh my goodness.
yeah, it was pretty naive of me to take it on, but and it could have potentially sunk me for sure as a business. Luckily, like my expenses at the time were still extremely low. Um, and yeah, it was quite an experience learning about. Basically, it was like that was my education in pneumatics and PLC controls. Um, I learned a lot on YouTube about how bottling lines work. uh, it turns out like the most difficult part of the whole process is how to get caps all turned the same way. Like you don't think about that when you start. You're like, oh yeah, okay, we'll put the caps on the thing, then we'll press them into place. Like, oh, how do you get 800 caps all facing the same direction? Huh, that's a challenge. Um, and it probably could have done a pretty good. I probably could have done a even better job, but the budget was really tight, and I felt constrained on time. Uh, so I think the machine's still running. They've been using it now for I think like close to 5 years, but they don't use the capping portion of it. They just use the filling portion.
Oh
Um,
no.
yeah, but that's fine. I'm, you know, the fact that they're still using it and they don't hate me is great. A big challenge as well was the fact that like kombucha is not necessarily a really uniform product. So we were dealing with like troubleshooting. Like I built the thing, I tried it with carbonated water, it worked great. Then I took it down to their place. We tried to run it with like their product in it, their kombucha product, which had like varying levels of carbonation at different temperatures, and then like all these crazy herbs and stuff they were throwing in there. And it took me weeks to get it to run consistently. Um, there was a lot of foam everywhere and half full bottles, and it was just like, what have I got myself into? This
Ugh.
is insane. Um, so yeah, where are we now?
It's
Sorry,
like
this
what,
is getting long.
2015, 2016. I'm there. It's actually
Yeah,
I'm going through your Instagram and like following along the story because
yeah,
you took a lot of pictures of all of these things, so it's actually kind of cool
yeah.
to see the origin story.
Yeah. My Instagram started as like liking bikes, and then pretty quickly I was like, oh, this is not a bike company. What am I saying? um, I did do the Kickstarter. I made like I think a little over a dozen of those frames. Um, some through the Kickstarter, some just for local folks. There's a bunch of them still out there. Um, and that was a cool process. And for a while, I was like, I'm going to be a machine shop, and I'm also going to build bikes. And it just wasn't really. They're pretty different skill sets, and the way you have to set up your shop is pretty different. And I just wasn't able to put the time towards the frame building, and have like slowly pushed that to the side. It took me a long time to kind of admit that that's not what I was doing anymore. But yeah, so Fadal ran that for some years, and then this opportunity, well, sort of an opportunity. Uh, some guy posted on one of the machinist groups on Facebook that he had a Herco for sale that he needed gone in a week and was selling for like $4,000, and it was down in Oregon. And I was like, oh, I should buy this. Like this seems like a great deal. And of course, it's never as great as it sounds. So I went down to look
Oh
at
no.
it. No, no, never. Went down to look at it. Everything seemed fine, and then like right before we shut it down, uh, the table just like rapided to zero. I was like, that's pretty weird. And the guy's like, yeah, there's an issue with the power, the DC power supply. Like it's a known thing. I'll take the cost of a new one off of it, off the cost of the machine. I was like, all right, everything else checked out. Like it cut a good circle. It seemed like it was a big step up from my Fadal. So the Fadal I had was this kind of oddball machine. It was called their VMC 40. So it was a 40 taper. It was like 8,000 pound machine, but it only had a 20 by 16 travel, um, and took up more space than what a Speedio's S700 takes up. So it was kind of an oddball. You could only get two vices on the table, and the tool change
Oh
was
wow.
slow and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, but good starting place. I was like, the Herco is a 20 by 40. It's got 24 tools, a dual arm tool changer. Like it's going to be a huge step up. It's 14,000 pounds. Going to be able to take a heavy cut, all that kind of stuff. Um, and so I found a rigger, and we went down, loaded it up, had it trucked back. And my shop is in a very challenging location from a doing business standpoint. We're at the end of a long dirt road, at the end of a very steep and twisty gravel driveway. Um,
Oh,
yeah, you can't get a big truck properly to the shop. You can get it like a block away if you have a very willing truck driver. But like I don't get deliveries here. I have to go pick them up from a friend's shop where I have everything delivered. Uh, So the guy, he brought in a big forklift. We actually like forklifted it a mile across town from where the trucker dropped the machine up to my shop. Um, got it loaded in. It was one couple of the weight covers were messed up. One of them was missing, so I had to put a bunch of money into it right off the bat. But I was like, this is going to be my nice machine. Like, get it set up right. I put a nice subplate on it, like with a grid pattern and dowel pin receivers and all this stuff. I'm like, I'm gonna set up fixtures, do the whole 9 yards. And then like I was getting the tool change. There was a little bit of funk in the alignment for the tool change between the spindle and the dual arm.
Hmm.
And so I had it like I was running through the manual setup so I could dial in the Z height. And it's sitting there, and all of a sudden the Z axis goes wild straight down into the arm of the tool changer, and it breaks the end of it off. The whole thing is torqued like all to hell. The machine finally alarms out, and I was just like, "Oh my god, what just happened?" And it turned out that the main motion control board in the control was faulty, and that's what the problem had been all along. Even though
Oh my goodness.
yeah. So now I had like a big paperweight with I need the new board was like $8,000, and I had to rebuild the tool changer, and so that was a real pain in the ass. But I did end up I had to borrow some money from my family to buy the board. I rebuilt the tool changer. I had to go like use my friend's press to straighten out the shaft because it was bent and realign the whole transmission. They call it the all the inner workings of the tool changer.
Hmm.
But got it running and was kind of just doing my thing. And then a friend, who's actually just an acquaintance, we'd only met once. Um, he was like, "Hey, I'm going to IMTS. My job is paying for a hotel room. If you want to come, you can just stay for free." And I was like, intriguing.
Oh, wow.
uh, yeah, so he works at the naval shipyard here as a tool maker. And at that point, he was like teaching their apprenticeship program. So he had some clout and was able to get his way paid.
Hmm.
Um, so I was like, okay, I'm gonna do this. I'm not gonna buy a new machine. I swear, I won't buy a new machine. uh, and we spent the whole week there. We had a lot of fun. Went to like the event that Saunders and Grimsmo and Pearson hosted at M Hub or whatever, and did that whole deal, and spent a week around Chicago, and uh, basically convinced myself that I needed a new machine, and came home and was trying to figure out how to make it work. Um, oh, and side note, found out while I was there that my wife was pregnant with our child. Um,
Oh
so
my goodness.
whole life is turning upside down. So I come home like about to have a baby, need to figure out how to make some more money. Uh, Machine payment seems like a great idea.
Yeah, just throw that on there.
Yeah, just add it on top. It's perfect. Um, but I was like, okay, I'm not going to do it. Really, I fell in love with the M140, the Brother Studio M140. I was like, that is a cool machine. Like, in theory, it could do everything. Came home, got a quote for it, and I was like, and put a little spreadsheet together of everything that would cost, all the associated costs, and I was like, oh man, that's looking pretty close to 200 grand by the time everything is said and done. I don't think that's going to happen. Uh, but and so I kind of put it to bed. Um, and then the local, uh, what's it called, Ganesh salesman came by, and he was like trying to talk me into buying one of their drill tap centers. And I was like, well, it's a pretty reasonable price. So it kind of got me going down that road. And then I was like, for kicks, I should probably get a robo drill and a speedio quoted out as well. And I was like, well, they're actually not that far off. And I came home from IMTS kind of like I had up until that point been like, I don't want to make lots of parts. Like I want to make machines. I want to design stuff from scratch. And through that whole time, I was like, the process of doing production is actually really intriguing, and you're kind of doing that on a regular basis in producing lots of parts and kind of setting those systems up. Um, and I was like, I think I really need a machine with a fourth axis to kind of, streamline things to be able to make a living at this. Um, and so I ended up that when all was said and done, I managed to weasel somebody into lending me some money to to buy that first Speedio, and just was kind of like, I don't need to make much money. So worst case scenario, we won't eat, I guess. But I'm pretty sure I can make what was it, like $2,400 a month if all else fails, and not lose the machine. Um, and so yeah, that's kind of how New Machine World started for me, and it's been great. It opened up a lot of doors for sure.
Yeah, and started you down the Speedio Mafia route.
Yeah, I was like kind of born in the like more iron is better old school kind of mentality. And I think the first person I ever saw who had one was Tactical Keychains. And I remember like I saw his first post with the Speedio, and I was like, "Oh no, why did you do that?" And now I'm like super proponent of the whole style of machining. Um, and someone else who I really respect in the machining world, who's also in the bicycle industry, at one point was like, "That's a job for a robo drill." This was before I'd even heard of a Speedio, and I was like, "What's a robo drill?" And looked it up, and I was like, "Oh, that's kind of interesting." Um, and when I bought that Herco, I was like, "Well, now I kind of have like a heavy duty 40 taper and a strange 40 taper. Um, Ideally, I would have a 40 taper and a 30 taper, and be able to kind of put jobs on either one that were appropriate for either." And so I was kind of convincing myself that I needed to get rid of the Fadal to replace it with a 30 taper. But I think really I just wanted a fast machine.
Yeah, it's funny how once you have your mind made up, whether you think you have your mind made up or not, you start finding reasons and making excuses, and you're like, oh no, this is the right thing to do, no matter what.
It's definitely yeah, that's what happens. And on the business side of this, it's like it's really hard to know when you're in the right and when you're in the wrong with that. And so far, it's worked out, but it's mostly worked out by just not paying myself very well. And that's kind of one of my big goals for this next year, is to get the business to a point where I can make a fair wage. And it was really refreshing listening to your last guest last week from Pantechnicon Design, and um, I felt like he had a lot of really good insight on the business side of things, because we can dork out about machining all day, but like what usually sinks a shop is not the fact that you can't make good parts. I think it's that you can't run a business very well.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading that book that he recommended on why I should pay myself a fair wage when I go full time.
Yeah, was that the extreme? No, that was the Simple Numbers book. Is that right?
Yeah, I got it right here. It is
Yeah,
Simple
I wrote a
Numbers,
note.
Straight Talk, and Big Profits.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to check that out as well, because I just kind of never made money that much and got used to it. But now we have a child and a mortgage, and it's like nice to buy what you'd like to eat at the grocery store and be able to fix your car and just the basic life stuff. I'm like, this can't go on like this forever. Something's got to give at some point. And bringing on a partner, he makes a pretty decent wage right now. So if I want to get him in here full time, we've got to get the business on its feet to a point where it can pay both of us a good wage. Um, so that's my primary goal going
Yeah, so
forward.
that's a good segue right into our questions that we got from the listeners. Jonathan
Yeah,
F. Rowley asked, how did you come to have a partner in the business, and what are your thoughts on being a solo entrepreneur versus having a partner when it comes to machining?
yeah. I've wanted a partner for a long time. Um, I I mean, I'm perfectly capable of working alone, but I like working with other people. I like being collaborative, um, and it's nice to have someone to bounce ideas off of. I will be the first to say that I don't always have the best idea about how to go about something. I usually come up with something that works, but um, even just having him here, it's been like 1 to 2 days a week basically since I think June. Um, there's been several occasions where I've been like, "Hey, what do you think about this?" And he's like, "No, I don't think that. I think you should do it this way." And I'm like, "Oh, you're totally right. Like, what was I thinking? That was a terrible way to go about it." Um, so on the day to day, there's that. And then also just, I think you've probably experienced this, but running a business, there's an emotional toll for sure of the stress of trying to make it all work. And having someone to kind of share that with uh, just makes a lot of sense to me. Kind of carry the burden between on two sets of shoulders, and um, have someone with different skill sets, slightly different skill sets, different perspectives. I think it just adds a lot of value. Um, I do think it's not a for sure thing. I've joked with a lot of people that it's like owning a business with somebody is like it's the closest thing you'll get to being married, but you don't get to have any makeup sex when things go wrong. So it's like you're financially entangled. You spend a ton of time with each other. You have to deal with each other's quirks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's none of that. You don't have the what you have in a marriage where, besides makeup sex, obviously, but just all the joy that comes in a marriage, and the ways that you blow off steam. So I think there's a lot of potential pitfalls. Um, but the way this came about is I've sort of been trying to find a partnership of some kind for quite a while, and I've explored some different things with different friends. Um, and basically, he was like, he and I had been tossing ideas around for a long time. Uh, but it's a challenge, as I'm sure you have discovered. Like people have been giving you a hard time for not going full time in your shop, but I just want to say, like, I 100% understand the challenge inherent, especially at this point in your life when you've had a good job, you probably have a standard of living you're used to, you have financial responsibilities. Like, it's not just like we're talking about responsibly buying new machines. Like, it's not responsible just to like throw everything in all your eggs in one basket and be like, oh, I think this is going to work out. Um, so we've been talking about ideas, kicking ideas around for how to make it work, and we kind of didn't really have a good plan for a long time that wasn't going to either put a lot of risk on one of us, a lot of financial strain on one of us, or a lot of time strain on one of us. But this in June, it got really busy, and he was like, "Hey, I'll just come help you one day a week." Um, he works like a what they call a what is it 459, so he gets every other Friday off. He was like, "I'll come by every other Friday at the least and help you with stuff, and we'll just kind of feel it out, see if we even like working together." We'd met through mountain biking, and I really enjoyed having him here. I think he enjoys being in the shop, and so we were just tossing ideas around, and that's actually how the second Speedio came about. Is kind of a multi-pronged approach. I was like, in order for this shop to support your salary and my salary, we're going to need to have a little more capacity because the Herco is slow. Um, it ends up sitting there a lot because it makes sense to put machines on the Speedio, but then the Speedio gets backed up. So having two machines that I can jump jobs back and forth and programs back and forth from makes a lot of sense. And then the way we're working this partnership thing is basically he's working quarter time more or less, but instead of paying him, I put the money towards that machine payment, and that's his equity in the business over the next year or two while he's still just here part time. And then at some point he will come full time and do a proper buy-in, and that's when, so it's like we're sort of in an interim agreement, and I felt like that was a way that was kind of a win-win for all of us, where the shop, he's investing in the shop, but it's not putting a lot of strain on his life and his finances. Um, the shop is getting a lot out of it in increased capacity, um, without putting a huge strain on me. And we are getting his labor to help pay for that work. So
That's
I've
awesome.
got,
That's a really good way
yeah,
to structure it. I was going to ask how you guys were working that up, but that sounds like a
yeah,
really equitable way that neither of you is really getting hurt by
yeah.
it. I guess it's a pretty win-win situation.
Yeah, because we had gone back and forth on all kinds of different things, and it was like, no matter what, in any other scenario, like one of us was going to be caught with like one foot on the dock and one foot in the boat, and like the boat going out to shore. I'd be like, how's this going to work out? Um, you're obviously experiencing that right now, where there's like at some point, if you just like switch from one to the next, like you have to take this leap, and it's something's going to be uncomfortable. Um, so that was our solution for now. And then at some point, and he's going to focus on kind of building up some money that he can buy into the business with when he comes on full time. Um,
Awesome.
yeah, so I think it's going to work out really well, and we may need to hire an employee as well at some point, but I'd rather have him in here. It was pretty amazing. Like the first day he showed up, I was like, "Hey, we got these 6 parts. Which one do you want to work on?" He's like, "Oh, I'll take that one." Handed him the print, and he was like, 20 minutes later, he's like, "Where do you keep your screwdrivers?" I was like, "Over there." He's like, "Cool." And then an hour later, "Where's the wrenches?" "Over there." "Cool." And then at the end of the day, he had stuff made, and I was like, well, "That was amazing." Because
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty
you know,
epic right there.
yeah, and I mean, obviously, like he's gonna fetch a good salary because he's really capable, and we have to get the business to that point where it can pay him what he's worth. But I have no regrets about that. I think it's going to be a great way to go. Like I've had a couple of people in here, just little kids for like, or not little kids, little jobs with like teenagers. Um, and it's every time I'm kind of like, was it worth it? Like I probably could have just done it myself. Um, the only times it's
Right.
really been worth it is like really tedious jobs. That I was like, I just can't do that. But yeah, so that's kind of the partnership thing. I think it's not for everyone. If you're coming at it from a pure bean counting perspective and like want to make the most profit at the end, I think there's strong arguments to be made for not having a partnership, um, and just hiring employees. But from a quality of life standpoint and just sustainability of the business, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I've got a lot of friends in business in partnerships who swear by it. So that's kind of where I'm at with it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm a strong proponent of it too, and I definitely echo your sentiment about having somebody to bounce stuff off of. And like for me, I think that like Brad's a really competent machinist, and I like being able to bounce things off of him as far as that goes. But really, it's like the business thing because neither of us are trained businessmen, and so like when I come across like, oh, this customer is being difficult, or like, you know, how do you think that this sounds like this? Does this sound like a good response to what they're asking? Like it's nice to have somebody else besides my own mind to just mull things over. It
Yeah,
is really, really nice.
yeah, for sure. He's definitely, I think, more my partner John. Um, he, I think, has a wider range of experience when it comes to pure machining because he's worked in more shops and on more machines. Um, and he's actually like been trained, whereas I just kind of like figured out my way through this stuff. Um, but he's never really handled the business side of things, and I wouldn't call myself an expert in that by any stretch, but I'm learning and kind of jumping in with both feet. So we have a lot of overlap in the machining, but I think in the long term, probably he's gonna probably lead that side of the business, and I will end up most likely leading. There'll be a lot of overlap, obviously, but taking taking more of a direct hand in the business side of things.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah. If I've learned anything from some of these books I've read is that there's always going to be some overlap there, but you definitely want to have like a clear definition of what your main roles are and things like that. So it sounds like
Yeah,
you already have a really good inkling of what that's going to be.
yeah, I think so. And it's not necessarily what I would choose if I was like, "What's my dream?" Like, I like running machines. Um, Honestly, I'm happiest when I'm like juggling 3 machines and running back and forth from one to the next. But that only keeps the business going for a day. uh, and you gotta keep the business side of things going, communication, quoting, ordering, all that kind of stuff. So, um, yeah, that's how it's going to be for a while, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned the new Speedio. Thomas Hosford asked, he wanted to hear the epic
Oh,
nightmare story of getting the Herco out and getting the new Speedio in. And I
yeah.
remember you posting about it, but I don't remember the story either. So I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah, I didn't go into a lot of detail because I didn't want to. Yeah, I don't want to throw the guy under the bus, but I just won't use his name. Um, I don't think I don't think he had any real ill intent, uh, but he made a couple choices that I thought were poor, and and then at the end didn't kind of wasn't real. What's the word? It just courteous or like good about it. So basically, like I mentioned, I'm in this weird spot. The shop is in this challenging to get to place. Um, and I kind of knew that hiring like a reputable rigger was going to be exceedingly expensive. And I'd worked with this guy twice before. He brought in the Herco originally, and then he brought in the first Speedio that I brought and took out the Fidal. Um, and everything had been fine. He's like a one man show. He's got his own truck, rents forklifts. Um, and with this one, I was like, I could bring in. I could the Speedio's small, like I could deal with it myself. Uh, but whatever, I'll just have him deal with the trucker and bring it in. He'll move the Herco out and take it to the buyer. That's how he's going to make most of his money, and uh, I'll pitch him a little cash for just unloading it off the truck, the Speedio off the truck, and getting it in here. um, so he doesn't have a facility where he can receive machines like most riggers would. So
Hmm.
I'll start by saying that I know that the correct way to go about this is to have the rigger receive the machine and then just bring it to you. But it seemed a little out of the question for this. Um, so he doesn't have a location. So he was just going to like juggle it with the trucker. And the trucker showed up like a day earlier than we expected. So he was like, "Well, I'm gonna have him bring it to my place. I'll unload it at my place and then bring it up later in the week when I have time." It's just like his house, I think. He postponed that. Then the next day, he was gonna have them bring it to this other place where he was doing a bunch of rigging in this big woodworking shop, and he was gonna put it in their facility for the night and then bring it up the next day. Then he postponed that, and he was just gonna meet the trucker at my friend's shop here in town where we'd unloaded machines in the past. I was like, cool, whatever, you're handling it. That's great. The morning of, so this is a Wednesday, we're supposed to meet the trucker at 10. He calls me at 9. He's like, hey, I'm going to be a couple hours late. I had some legal stuff come up with my ex-wife. I'm running around getting documents, taking them to the lawyer, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, okay, well, I guess, I guess that's what you got to do. A couple hours late, it's not the end of the world. So I drive over to get my stuff together and meet the trucker. And I was like, I better just stop and tell him that he's running late. So I pull up and I'm like, hey, how's it going? I just want to let you know that the rigger's a couple hours late. And this guy's like, couple hours? And I think he was Turkish. It was a very strong accent. I could only understand every couple words. So he yells a bunch of stuff. I'm like, I don't really know what you're saying. And he gets his dispatch on the phone and hands the phone to me. It's COVID time, so we're like trying not to be close, like wearing masks, like trying to figure out this whole situation. And the dispatch is like, "Hey man, like you guys have already rescheduled on us twice. Like this is not cool." He's clearly pissed off. Um, and I was like, "Okay, well we'll try and figure something out. Um, I'll go talk to the guys here, see if we can use their forklift." The Speedio shipping weight listed on the whatever the shipping packing slip is like 4,700 pounds. My friends at the wood shop there have this like super clapped out 5K forklift with 4 foot forks. And I'm like, this is
Oh.
probably not going to work, but I'm going to go ask them if it's okay anyway. Uh, as I'm walking in, the Yamazen salesman calls me. He's like, "Hey, what's going on there? They're gonna start charging us for delay times right now. Like, what's gonna happen? Like, can you figure out a way to get it off?" I'm like, "Oh God, this is just getting more expensive by the minute." Um, so my friends say that I can use the forklift. The trucker's like, "Great." He starts unstrapping this thing. I'm like, "Oh, I'm not even sure if this is going to lift it. We put on these like Amazon quality fork extensions. They're just like bent sheet metal into a channel with like a little
Mhm.
hook at the back, but they're 8-foot fork extensions, and we drive it over there. Oh, first of all, we can't get it out of park. To start off, we're like, oh, this is not great. We can't even drive the thing at first, but we finally like get the parking brake loose because it was like seized. Uh, and we do like a little test lift, and the rear fork extension is bending like 2 inches on the far corner, like clearly visible bend. And I'm like, this is terrible. And the extensions are lifting off. So I have John run up to our shop. He's got a bunch of like really heavy duty C clamps and brings them back. We clamp the fork extensions to the forks in a few different places. We do a bunch of blocking to try and get everything leveled out. We do another lift, everything comes up okay, and we get it off the truck and lower it down. And the truck driver's happy. He drives away. I'm like, sweet, we dodged that bullet. No one's going to charge us any money. Crisis averted. And we get it loaded onto my trailer. I text the rigger. I'm like, hey, we got it off. No stress. They're not going to charge us, etc. So we drive it up onto my trailer to my shop and wait. And he's 6 hours late when he finally shows up. So it's like, this is November. We're in Washington, so it's like 4:45. We've got like maybe 40 minutes of light left. Um, so he pulls up just down the hill from my shop, unloads the forklift, and he's like, I got to get this truck back down the hill through those tight corners while it's still light out because we're not going to make it if it's dark. So he leaves the forklift with me, drives the truck back down. I got to figure out how to drive a what was it? I think it's like a 25,000 pound capacity diesel forklift. Like get it up to the shop and like move everything around that needed to be moved with a forklift. Like I have a pallet stacker here, but I don't have a proper forklift. And there was all this stuff that I'd palletized to ship, and it needed to get out of the way. So I'm like learning how to drive this thing, getting stuff moved around. Um, and so backing up slightly, when I'm prepping the Herco to move it, um, I had run just like traditional miscible coolant in there, and I was as I'd gotten new machines, I was switching over to the Synergy, the Blaser Synergy,
Mhm.
and so I was like, I had a bunch of the concentrate left over, and I was pumping out the coolant out of the sump and cleaning it, and I just asked the guy who's buying it, I was like, hey, he was going to take the concentrate. I was like, hey, do you want the coolant out of the machine? And he was like, sure, yeah, I'll take it. I was like, sweet, that's easy. So I pumped it into a barrel. I didn't have the locking ring for the lid, but it had the seal. So I like put it on a pallet, got the seal, shrink wrapped it, ratchet strapped the whole thing down to the pallet. Everything seemed cool and kosher. So going back to moving the machines, he shows up. It's like 6 o'clock at this time after having gotten his truck back down the hill and back up. Um, and we all kind of jump into gear, moving stuff around, getting the Herco out of here. And we're going through the logistics. I'm like, okay, so you guys are going to forklift the Herco down the hill. Let's put these 3 pallets of stuff. So it's like all the tooling, phase converter, this drum of coolant, like manuals, spare parts, all that kind of stuff. And he's like, what's that in the drum? I was like, it's coolant. He's like, huh, hazmat. Huh, okay. And then he just like keeps going back to what he was doing. I was like, well, okay, whatever. I guess it's not a big deal. Um, So we put it on the trailer, get everything loaded, get the Speedio back into the shop, and it's like 9:30 at this point. Um, all the pallets are on my trailer. They start driving the Herco down the hill, and I go down with the truck and my trailer and the pallets on the back. Get that all unloaded. It's like 10:30 now, and I'm like, okay, are we cool to go? Like, I gotta get home. Like, I've got a 1-year-old at home. I'm exhausted. Uh, he was like, yeah, how much did we agree on for price? And I was like, well, we talked about $1,000 for unloading the Speedio, but I kind of did half of it. So I don't know if that's fair. And he kind of started hemming and hawing about it, and I was like, whatever, I do not want to argue about this. So I pull out my checkbook. This is a funny thing. I'm like, I pull out my checkbook. He's like, oh, I was kind of hoping for cash. I was like, oh, I didn't have cash. And I was like, well, what are the options? He's like, well, also my debit card's not working. So he'd had his nephew working with him the whole time. It
Hmm.
was like just they were fighting the whole time, which made this super fun on top of everything else. Just swearing at each other and arguing about how they were going to go about stuff. So I ended up having to like Venmo his nephew the $1,000. I'm like, whatever, this is done. I'm going home. My machine is on the floor. It's in his hands. I'm out of it. I hit the road, go home, put my phone on silent so we don't wake my daughter up. I ate a little bit of food and go to bed. The next morning, I wake up, check my phone. There's a text. It was like, there's an issue with this barrel of coolant. It's like, huh, that's a little weird. So I responded. I was like, did you get it figured out? And I don't hear anything. I go to work. Uh, John's there that day. We're working. Like 3 in the afternoon, I get a response. No, I left it on the side of the road. I was like,
What?
what? Yeah. Like, you gotta be kidding me. You left it on the side of the road. And we had this whole back and forth about it. He was like, yeah, I couldn't get it to seal. It was going to, splash coolant on my tires and ruin my braking. I couldn't afford it, that risk. And I couldn't get it back up the hill because it was leaking. And I was like, it wasn't leaking. We had moved it 3 times with the forklift at that point and driven it down the hill on my trailer. It hadn't been leaking. It turned out that he had like unpacked that whole pallet that I'd put together, unstrapped it, seen that it wasn't attached, and then like couldn't get it to seal properly again and just ditched it on the side of the road. And
Oh my goodness.
yeah, I was pretty pissed. And that's in like my little town where it's like a little beach town. It's like like everybody, and he's like left this barrel of toxic waste attached to my name next to the like community center across the street from the beach. And a barrel of coolant is like 400 pounds or something. It's not like I was just going to go down with a buddy and pick it up and put it in my truck. um, so I had to trailer my tractor over here from home and drive it back up the hill. And yeah, so after having paid him $1,000 for a job that he didn't do, and then have him waste half of my day having to deal with that, and having him argue about the fact that that was a bad choice, I was not very pleased. I guess I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I don't blame you. That's insane. But it was a good story. So
Yeah, it is a good story. Yeah, yeah. I won't be hiring him again. I will probably be buying my own forklift soon instead, or next time I need to move any machines.
probably safer than trying that again. Yeah, but
Yeah,
still, I'm glad
yeah,
everything landed safely, more or less. Besides the coolant, but
yeah.
machine
I
on
am
the floor,
considering.
it's running.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and he unloaded the other machine fine. So the other guy was super happy who bought it. It's like, well, all right, that's fine then. Um, yeah, has made me consider a side hustle in rigging. I think there's money to be made there. Probably better money than machining
oh, ain't
if
that the
you're
truth? Like
responsible. Yeah,
it's insane how much they charge. Like our lathe that we bought, our manual lathe, we moved from literally across the street. Like if you go up our street to the next main road and across the street, it was at the building across the street. And I think
yeah.
they still charge us like $1,500 or $1,200 or something like that. And
Oh
it's
man,
like we thought about just renting a forklift and driving it across the street at night and like figuring it out. But we were
yeah,
like, no, we'll pay the riggers, we'll do it right, and then yeah, we immediately regretted that.
yeah. I've moved a lot of machines myself, and I'm pretty comfortable with it at this point. As long as they're under like 10,000 pounds, um, at least with the kind of equipment that we have. The couple times I've hired that guy, I've been like, I could definitely do this job as well as you are. I bought this Hitachi in June down in Oregon, and we unloaded it here without any tools at all. I mean, without any like heavy lift equipment, just with skates and come alongs and stuff. Um, and it went all right. It was a longish day, and it would have been nice to just pick it up with a forklift and drop it. But it's also nice not to spend $3,000 to have a $3,000 machine moved.
Yeah, yeah, I would. I completely agree.
Yeah.
Um, let's see, what other questions do we have? Thomas Hosford had also asked what goes into building full suspension mountain bike frames, because that is not like a usual thing that at least I've seen on Instagram or anything like that. Usually the boutique bike
Yeah.
builders are building hardtails or road bikes or something like that.
Yeah, there's a reason for sure. There's a handful of guys doing it. Most of them are doing like uh, model lines, not custom geometry. Um, yeah, the design time, it's really front loaded on the design time, and then there's just a lot more parts, but you can't really charge an equivalent increase. Um, so it's a very challenging market. That's why I chose not to pursue it. Really, I didn't do a good job when I started of really properly pricing out what a bike like that would cost to build. I was kind of like, I'm going to build it, see if people want it, figure it out as I go. Um, Not the way to do it. But yeah, I had the idea that I wanted to come up with my own suspension design, and I did, and it had some inherent quirks that made it not necessarily appropriate for super wide range of users. Like it works well for the kind of the middle of the road rider, really aggressive riders. Basically, I don't know how much into suspension kinematics you get, but it has a falling rate leverage ratio. So the effective suspension rate, uh, let's see, basically to put it in simple terms, the spring gets softer as you go deeper into the travel, which is the reverse of what most suspension designs are oriented towards. Um, So basically, like if you hit something super hard, you'll bottom out the suspension. But I was trying to ride the line between one patented design and another patented design. And kind of like that middle place that I ended up was this linkage scenario um, that produced really good pedaling and like power transmission kinematics, but had this spring rate issue. Um, but yeah, it's basically like uh, the actual welding part of it has a whole bunch of challenges in that you're trying to basically combine two two welded structures which are inherently going to have weirdnesses to them, inaccuracies, combine them with a bunch of very accurate machined parts, and then have everything move smoothly and have the bike stay straight at the end of it. um, it's certainly a challenge. I kind of went about it a few different ways, but what I settled on was basically like building the front end and welding all the linkage positions in place, the mounting positions in place with a fixture, um, and then doing the same with the rear, and then fixturing them up on the mill table and reaming them in place after everything was welded together, so that I knew that it was all square, and it worked pretty well. It's not perfect, but there's also this obsession with like perfection and alignment in the bike industry, and then you look at how bikes actually, a lot of production bikes are made, and no one ever notices the fact that things are totally out of square and our bodies aren't symmetrical, and you know, it's kind of a funny obsession, but it's also nice to be proud of your work. So I'm not sure quite where I land with that stuff in the end. It could go back and forth on it a lot. Um, yeah, I'm not sure if that fully answers the question. It's a lot of design time, and things can go sideways really quickly in the finished bike if you don't keep everything right where it needs to be.
Yeah, sure sounds like it. I mean, that I've only ridden a few full suspension bikes, and I can't even imagine designing it all and figuring all that out. So I definitely
Yeah.
give you props there.
Yeah, it was a learning experience as I went. Definitely started with that injury on the couch being like, basically throwing some points on the page in CAD and like dragging them around and kind of seeing how stuff worked. And then later I discovered a program that kind of lets you map it out a little bit better and map out your spring rates and ratios and all the different kinematic aspects of it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Let's see. So Built by Hutch had given you two questions. You've actually got some really cool work holding and fixturing stuff. So he wanted to know what's your go-to methods for holding odd shaped parts and favorite fixturing methods.
Yeah. So my go-to really is just kind of like the tried and true of Mighty Bite first op and soft jaw second op. Um, for anything that's over like, I don't know, 500 parts, I'm a big fan of making pallets. And I found the rock lock bases to be a really good kind of like universal work, like universal base that is works for your vices, but also is a relatively quick palette changing method. Um, so there's like, I don't have a ton of palettes because that was actually, I was referring to when John was like telling me my idea was bad. I, I had a big job this summer that was all this architectural door hardware, and the parts were all very similar, but there was a whole bunch of different sizes in the family. And I was trying to design this kind of like universal palette that was going to hold them all. And it was proving to be kind of a challenge. And he was like, just grab them in the vise. Like, you're going to be happier. And I did. And it worked great and was just as fast. And we had parts running in an hour instead of 2 days later or a day later or whatever. So I would say, like, when it comes to just holding the part, yeah, my just kind of classic tried and true Mighty Bites and Softjaw is my go-to. Um, when it comes to like the larger work holding, I have found the trunnion to be super versatile and save me a lot of headache and time on different parts, and especially for a while not having a lathe, being able to do round parts on the end and work aside was pretty helpful.
Yeah, definitely. That makes total sense. I really like your trunnions that you've made, both the single sided one and the double sided one. They're pretty neat.
Yeah, the single was really cool. I kind of miss it honestly because it's like sad to see it just sitting there on the shelf. Um, but being able to switch back and forth between the dual station orange vice uh, and the other vices and palettes really was. So I had um, basically 2019. I bought the first video that very end of 2018. In 2019, I was kind of growing into it. Um, and I was working obviously, but I wasn't making a ton of money or parts. So experimenting a lot, learning how to run it. Um, and then mid that year, this company that I'd done a decent sized job for the year before approached me about this project that they were doing. And another vendor was going to make a part. And they were and so basically they work in like fall safety, working at height, so like all things to do with working up high on bridges and stadiums and wind turbines and anywhere that somebody's working at height, they do engineering, training, installation of equipment, and all this everything to do with that. And I'd done a project with them the year before, kind of helping them figure out a solution to a bind they got into on a project, and they came back to me with this, and they were like, we're going to put all these lights up on top of the stadium. And the solution the architect had come up with was basically they had these LED strips that were like 3 feet long. The LED strip weighs like 2 pounds, and they had designed like 100-pound bracket to hold it in place. And this company I was working for was going to do the installation. And they were basically like, bringing these brackets up is going to like triple the cost of your installation. We need to figure out a different solution. So they came to me and they're like, hey, can we just machine a little aluminum bracket that the light bolts to at either end, and we'll clamp the I-beams? And I was like, yeah, we can definitely do that. So there was a lot of going back and forth. You would imagine when you look at a bridge or a big truss system that like all the I-beams are uniform because we don't like look at them that close.
Hmm.
But in actuality, oftentimes like each one is a specific spec for the kind of load that it's under. And in this case, this was for the stadium in Seattle, the baseball stadium. And there was like 20 different specs of I-beams. And so the distance between the two sides, the top and bottom of the I-beam and the thickness of the flange was different on almost every one. But they had to keep the lights in a perfect line within like an eighth of an inch
Oh,
because
geez.
somebody decided that was an important number.
Of course.
So
Yeah.
yeah, of course. And there was going to be, I think there was like 1,800 different light fixtures. Um, so they had a huge task at hand mapping the whole thing out to figure out basically where each light was going to land. Sometimes it was like one end of the light would land on one beam and one end would land on the other beam, so you'd have to have one bracket at one end that clamped a certain size and had a certain hole offset, and a different bracket at the other hand that had a different size and hole offset. It was pretty crazy. um, it took them months and months really to get that whole situation sorted out. And actually, when we hit go on the project, it was still sort of in process, and it was quite an undertaking. But all that to say, I made that trunnion basically for making those brackets. Um, they were essentially a little like a C clamp kind of, made out of aluminum with two bolts on one side that did the clamping, a couple holes on the other side that held little hold downs for uh, like protection cables to keep them from falling off, and then also for the wiring for the lights. And then on the top there was like some engraving for designating the spec of the bracket, and then a hole pattern to mount the light to it. Um, and I want to say there was like 55 different iterations or something. There was basically, I think there was 7 different size brackets that, we with different spacers we could accommodate different flange thicknesses, and then 50 within that there was like 55 different hole offsets, also that they could maintain that straight line of the light. um, yeah. And we're on this crazy deadline because we're racing the weather because they're working on the roof, and it's not a flat roof. It's sloped and it's pretty steep at some ends. So it's basically, if like the winds got to a certain level and it was raining, they couldn't be up there. And we started this in like August, and so we're coming into October at the end of the project. And because, you know from a manufacturing standpoint, I'm like, let's do all of one first, and then we'll do all of the next because that makes sense. But they had to work from one side to the other and then switch to the other truss and then work from the other side to that. So I was having, some of them I ran the same part probably like 6 different times at different times in the project. So it was quite a juggling act. But I built that trunnion with the base. I built 2 simple fixtures that held, for the smaller ones, it held 4 first ops and 4 second ops. And then for the larger ones, it was 2 and 2. Um, and for 9 weeks, basically, I was just standing there swapping parts and swapping pallets, and it was like basically wore out my Allen wrenches on the pit bulls and the Versa grips, or not the Versa grips, the Uniforce clamps. And I'd usually have about a minute to catch my breath before the pallet swapped. And then I had the spacers running in the Herco, so I was like literally running back and forth, and it was pretty crazy. Um, I built the trunnion for that, and wasn't sure I'd keep it on, but it ended up being really versatile, so I just kept it on there since.
Well, I'm glad it all worked out, but that sounds like quite the undertaking.
Yeah, it was like, I think prior to that, the biggest job I'd done was maybe like, I don't know, $18,000 or something total for a job, and the material order for that job was like $32,000. I remember like I'd been going back and forth with the supplier forever, and finally I was like, and they'd given me terms or whatever, but none of us had read the fine print, and so I like placed the order, and like an hour later, their accounting department calls me, and they're like, yeah, so you're only approved for $4,000 of credit, and this is a $32,000 order. We're gonna have to figure out how to make this work.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I was like, oh God, we need to be starting to make parts in like 2 days. Like, this can't be happening right now.
Oh
And
man.
that it was an undertaking. It was a really good experience. It was not fun. It was very stressful. And I but it was really cool. I think the gross on the job was a little over $80,000, and it paid for that trunnion to be built, and it paid for the tail support for it, and a bunch of work holding stuff and tooling, and then honestly, because I was just swapping parts for 2 months, 2.5 months basically, like I wasn't able to keep up with customers, and I had no work when I was done. Which worked out because that's when our baby was born a couple months later, and I had to work on the house, but it kind of paid for me to take a little time off and hang with the kiddo and the family and catch my breath and kind of come back fresh the next spring. But it was, yeah, quite an experience.
Yeah, no joke. Well, that also kind of runs into his other question, which was, do you like large quantity jobs or one-off difficult jobs?
Yeah. You know, if you've got a client who's willing to pay what a one-off difficult job actually costs, I really like them. But I don't have many of those clients. So I end up doing a lot of one-off difficult jobs for way too cheap. Um, and that makes me grumpy. So I've kind of the last year or two been pushing more towards large quantity jobs, um, just because I feel like, you know, I don't know, there's a little more wiggle room for, I don't know, you kind of know that you're going to at least get a decent sized check at the end of it. Um, and I sort of enjoy the work holding challenges of fixturing and getting parts on and off the machine fast, and gives you time to kind of tweak the program. Um, I find that when you do a one-off job, you just kind of like run things safe, and you don't ever push the machine. And so I enjoy both. I do have a bad habit of like when things are loose tolerance, I'm like, don't even check it because it doesn't matter. And a couple times that's gotten me into a bad spot. And it's fun when there's a difficult job and you really have to pay attention to every little thing and make sure it's all perfect. Um, so yeah, I'd say I like both. Obviously, I have a Speedio, or we have two Speedios now, so kind of oriented towards quantity, but also, and you've probably experienced this as well, people are like, well, why do you need a production machine for prototyping? And I'm always like, well, it's not like a production machine does prototyping bad, unless it's like maybe a pallet changing machine where it's hard to see the work area or something like that. But it's like, one of these machines, a Speedio, is going to do a better job than a tool room mill, as long as you can get the part inside the enclosure,
Right.
for the
Yeah.
most part. And I always find, even if you're doing 10 parts, it's great to like run it slow once and then turn it up to full speed and go home an hour earlier. Like, no one's going to argue with that.
Right. Oh yeah. Well, and the argument I also give is like, well, if my machine can run production for 5 years straight or 3 years straight in China in a sweatshop, how long is it going to last me? Doing onesie twosie and taking care of it, in a nicer shop.
Yeah.
Like, it just shows
Yeah.
the longevity of these machines. So yes, I can turn it up and I can run a bunch of parts if I want to, but it also holds tolerance really well. And,
Yeah.
it's not it's for the price, it's a very good machine.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. Yeah. And they seem to take abuse even when you do stupid stuff. I've learned from experience. on
Cool.
that
And then,
on that production job, I made a couple mistakes and crashed some tools, and thought I'd ruined my whole year, but it ended up being okay. It just makes a little more noise now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and worst case, like they can come out and just swap your spindle, which it's not cheap, but it's definitely cheaper than a new machine. So
Yeah,
it
or you
happens.
honestly, I watched the guy do it when he brought this machine in because it has the dual contact and they ship with the standard. So they swapped the spindle here when they delivered it. I was like, that's pretty easy. And then when I crashed the spindle, I swapped the coupler and had to rebalance it myself. And, you know, the only thing involved in actually swapping the spindle is a few more bolts. Um, you could do it yourself in a couple hours pretty easily.
Yeah, yeah. Our TC actually came with a spare spindle when we bought it
Nice.
used, and so I've always kept that as my like insurance policy on that machine for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then his last question was for me. I owe the podcast, I guess, an update on my car. I can't remember if I've talked about it on here, but he was asking if I was still moving forward with the speed we know, and he was curious because he runs a DIY plug and play Mega Squirt on his Miata, and I can't remember if I talked about it on here, but anyway, I decided to go K swap instead of my 3S GTE, which means I'm no longer using my speed we know and going down that rabbit hole of building my own board and all that, which was a fun exercise and grew my skills a little bit. But now I'm just going with a Honda ECU mod, which is cheaper than a full standalone ECU and easier. It's plug and play on the Honda wiring harness and all that stuff, so it's a lot easier. So that's the short update on the car. Um,
Cars.
yeah, yeah, that's what I think about when I'm not thinking about machining. So, um, so Hackett Industries said that he just found out about you from the podcast, which is great. And then he had a question on how it's been learning about marketing and becoming known in the bike industry. And he knows that frame building tools are more of a niche market, but that he wanted to kind of know how it is to get started in the industry like that.
Yeah, it's been slow. My whole business has grown, obviously, from my description, kind of organically and circuitously, and it's been very word of mouth. Um, Entrance into the bike industry has been basically Instagram and people I've met face to face in the industry, or introduced by a mutual friend. Um, and it's been not a. I think this was another question in there somewhere, like whether it pays the bills or not.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, that was Wesley Carr's question. Yeah, it was about is
yeah,
bike parts the majority of your work and does it pay the bills?
yeah. A year ago, I would have said no, not at all. Um, it was like an interest. Um, so you had Joe on a couple weeks ago, who's building frame tools now, and he was very well positioned when there was a big shift in the frame building industry, and that one of the main suppliers of tools retired and shut his shop down and created this big opening. Um, and actually, when that first happened, I was like, I should do that. And then I was like, I have too much on my plate. Um, Joe was very smart and already had his foot in the door and went for it. And I definitely applaud him for that. Um, and I'm starting to push more in that direction with the tools and definitely with the parts. And it's been a slow build. I've been doing a lot of partnering with a company called Bike Fab Supply, and that has been really helpful because he places big enough orders to make it worth my while to start developing these products. Because doing it totally on spec can be pretty terrifying. You put so much time into the product development and then you don't know if they're going to sell at the end of the day. Um, so that's been really helpful. I actually just was doing my like end of year bookkeeping today and saw that question, and so I went and did a little quick calculation, and my bicycle related stuff was basically a fifth of my income for the last year, or gross income for the shop for the last year. And I would say most of that was in the last half of the year. So it feels like it's gaining momentum. Um, and it's hard to know like what things make that happen. Um, there was one little project I did where I made a set of custom cranks for a guy, and I was kind of like, I actually, the reason I made them is because I'd made him a version a year prior, and one of them broke. So I was making him a new set basically on spec, just because I was like, ah, that sucks. I should make that better. um, so made a revamped version, and then right after that, all of a sudden there was like a flood of emails about bicycle related projects, and it's like, so you never kind of know what's gonna tip stuff um, over the balancing point. Um, and especially with social media, it seems like there's a lot of people who are kind of like watching, but you don't know that. And then something, you know, catches their interest enough to get them to reach out. Um, and it seems like there's potential for that to kind of build upon itself. Um, which I was thinking about today is like there's in um, and the business side of stuff, like the thing I'm really coming up against recently is quoting, and how much of a time investment and like how much kind of like emotional investment it takes, and how complicated it is to do it well and but quickly, and all these things, um, and all of the little pieces that are involved, um, and the fact that like we really want to boil things down to like, you know, we're always like time and materials, like machine run time, like takes this many minutes at this rate, like this is what the part's going to cost. And there's so much more to it that. And one thing I've been thinking about recently is like how much that we often think of the customer as just bringing money to the equation, and like that's kind of like what they input, but like they actually bring a lot more to the equation than that. And part of that is, you know, whether they are a member of your community and are going to vouch for you, um, whether the product they want you to make will, you know, kind of add to your portfolio in a good way, all these different things. And that crank set was kind of an interesting example because like I didn't make any money on that, but it had a big effect on the business. And working with people locally, I'm like, sometimes people bring me these little projects and I'm like, you know, that is really not worth my time. But the fact that you know about me, and maybe when you do have something that's worth my time that's bigger, you will come to me first, is worth it in the long run. Um, that's kind of a circuitous way of saying that I don't really know how to enter into the bike industry. I don't think it's like flooded. I think there's not a lot of people that have bothered to enter the market, but the prices are a little bit low, so it's a challenging market to enter. Um, and it requires a lot of tribal knowledge to enter it well, because it's not, like I said, people don't give you good prints. Like you have to know how bikes work and how they're put together in order to design and build parts for them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Definitely.
Yeah, yeah. I
Cool.
think
Well, that kind of wraps
hopefully I
up.
answered that. Yeah,
Oh, I think so. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it sounds like it's just a tough industry to get into because it's part. I don't want to say like art, but it's like kind of like art and mechanical, and there's like this deep emotional connection that a lot of people have with their bikes. It seems like. So
yeah,
I think there's a lot of emotion driven purchases too, and so all those kinds of industries are kind of hard to break into.
yeah. Emotion, aesthetics, all that kind of stuff. Um, and we're in a tough economy, and like bikes seem really expensive, but frame builders are not making good money. Most of them, some of them are, but a lot of them are not. Um, so they're always trying to get the cheapest stuff. So you have to figure out how to provide them with what they want at a price they can afford, that still makes a viable product down the line to the end customer.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of wraps up the questions. Let's talk about shop things. What's going on recently with you guys? New tooling, new fixturing. What's fun?
Yeah, I got a coffee pot today. That was awesome.
I saw that. We actually just got one for the first time for the shop like a week or two ago, and it's so nice to have.
Game changer for sure. My mom's a caterer and actually just lives like a block away and has a commercial kitchen in her basement with an espresso machine. So I often walk down and get espresso, but it does take about 20 minutes, and sometimes I can't do that. So it's good to have a coffee machine. Let's see what else is new in here. So John has been using an old laptop that doesn't run CAD software super well. So I've got a new laptop that matches mine coming in, and going to give him one of my screens, my extra screen. And I ordered two new screens for me and a stand. So I'll have like a 3-screen setup, because I'm overgrowing two. What else we got in here? Been trying to get like the tool stations at the machines a little better set up. So I got torque wrenches and dedicated Allen wrench sets for each of the mills. Um, so that's kind of the stuff that's come in. Nothing super exciting. And then today I was doing a lot of research on collet chucks for the lathe, trying to find a not too expensive option because this machine was inexpensive and I don't know how long it's going to last. But right now we've got a 5C collet chuck and then a 3-jaw, and we end up swapping back and forth between them a lot. So I'm trying to find a larger format collet chuck that we can get for the machine without too much cost difficulty. I've got like what is it called? Like a hardened super collet system chuck where it has like one collet that you put different pads in, but it's the wrong spindle face. So I might just have to make an adapter.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, we'll see. Or I may just buck up and buy something. But we paid $3,000 for this machine. It's hard to spend $3,000 on a chuck for it, even though it might make sense in the long run.
Yeah, no, I know the feeling. Like whenever we had to spend money on the kitty, it was like this machine was fairly cheap. Like, do we really want to put that much more into it?
Yeah,
But I
it's
guess
hard.
that's the downside of getting a deal is you're like you gotta sometimes spend more than your deal to keep it running.
Yeah, and it's like we don't need it. It just would be nice to cut down on setup times for that machine because it can be a little finicky anyway. Um, so, and I'm just worried that we're gonna put a bunch into it and then it's just gonna die, and we're gonna have to buy something new that the chuck won't fit on. So, anyway, that's what I was looking at today for the most part.
Cool. Well,
Yeah,
sounds like things are going well then. Business
yeah,
partner, all that.
yeah. It's exciting. Now we just got to make more money.
Always, always.
Yeah.
Well, I guess you kind of already answered this, but I always ask everybody, what did you research this week? So, is there anything you researched that isn't a call check or machining related?
Yeah, well, sort of machining related. I've been looking at Pro Shop a lot this last week and scheduled a little demo for the end of this week. Um, been talking the last week with a acquaintance who runs a shop in Seattle who's kind of similar story to myself, like self-taught, kind of just started organically from the ground up. But he's, I don't know, 3 to 5 years ahead of me. He's got several employees and nicer machines and all that. And he just started using it this last year. And it seems like everything I hear is like you should have started using it before you needed it, because when you need it, it's a pain in the butt to implement. Um, and just having John here, some realizing like how much is in my head and how much these systems really just rely on me knowing how I do it, and that's not going to work in the long run. Um, so it's maybe a little ahead of what we need, but I'm thinking about switching over to using ProShop or some ERP system, but they seem pretty dialed. Um, just because right now this whole business relies on the fact that like I can do 3 things at once, like keep a machine going, CAM program, and quote and communicate with customers at the same time. And so, in order for us to get more work through, I need to make those things more efficient. And right now, like machine capacity is not our limiting factor. We've got 3 relatively fast machines. We do not maintain their full, spindle uptime. So the limiting factor at this point is me being able to keep material and tooling on hand and get jobs in the door, and be able to program. So anything that's going to make that faster, I think, is going to be a real game changer. Uh, so yeah, seriously thinking about trying to implement that, so I don't have to put as much of my attention towards it. The quoting thing, especially, like I found that to be a real stumbling block, um, to do well. And when it's gotten really busy, I've started just slapping numbers on things, and that's not a good way to go about it in the long run.
Yeah, that I've done the same thing, and like you either win big or you lose big, but it's very
Yeah,
rare that you're like, oh man, I quoted that spot on, and slapping a guess on it.
yeah, and being able to track what things actually take compared to what I quoted. I don't have a good system for that right now, and a lot of that's built in. All the stuff you want is built in. So I'm kind of like, if we're going to start setting up file management and best practices and stuff right now, why don't we just, now that John's coming in, why don't we start on the right foot and just not have to think about it again?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Pro Shop is definitely on my radar for the future.
Yeah, yeah, that. And then I also started talking with a friend who's a business major about getting some business consulting, because I think that's, at this point where it's like we need to grow a considerable amount in the next year, and how to do that responsibly and effectively is, I'm a little out of my depth. I feel like I have a really good vision and a really good goal, but that's substantially different from a plan and a strategy. Uh, and so I think getting a little bit of help on what are the intermediate steps between here and there, what are safe steps to take, and how to prioritize those. That's it's kind of top of my list.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's. I wish I had more business experience or somebody that I could fall back on for that
Yeah,
kind of stuff. So I totally understand that.
yeah,
Well,
yeah,
cool. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast, and
yeah, man.
I had no idea like the depth of your story. Like you have done everything under the sun. You really are a jack of all trades when it comes to
Yeah, trying to be less of one, more of a specialist. But
that.
yeah, yeah. Thanks for having me on. Like last week's guest as well, I kind of felt like a little bit unqualified, but also I think hearing people midstream and their story is really valuable for the other folks who are in this process trying to figure out what how to put the pieces together. So glad to be able to share that.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I absolutely adore my audience, but one thing that I absolutely love about the podcast is it's uninterrupted time. I can just chat with other business owners. So, I mean,
Yeah,
don't anybody definitely shouldn't feel like they're out of their depth coming on the podcast because I'm in no way an expert. We've had some really great people on here, but it's like just an excellent time for me to get to chat with some really cool people. And I hope that, everybody who listens gets the same kind of thing that I do, which is just, getting to geek out about machines and hear cool stories and just have other people to fall back on as far as being business owners or entrepreneurs or whatever you want to call what you're doing
yeah,
or what we're all doing.
yeah. I kind of think we need to start a new hashtag that's like machinist business owner stuff or something. I don't know what it would be yet, but you know, that's specific to the kind of things that we're all tackling, because it's definitely a niche thing to dork out about, is spreadsheets.
Yeah, getting a coffee maker, getting
Yeah,
excited about
yeah,
it.
precisely.
Yeah. Well, again,
Cool,
thank you
cool.
so much for taking the time to come on. I really appreciate it, and thanks everyone for listening. We'll be back next week.
Right on.